To follow on from Dan's video, could Nigel Farage sue anybody? If so, whom and for what? And what might happen? Dan's already covered what we, the breach of the GDPR and all the confidentiality stuff. But let's say Farage wanted to bring a claim against anybody. Who would that be? The obvious target being Coutts stroke the NatWest group. But what would be the basis of the claim? Well, to look at the background facts, as you probably all know, but to summarise, Farage had his account closed with Coutts. It was leaked out that that was because he didn't meet the financial considerations anymore. He put forward a subject data request, access request, which gave all these sort of inside discussions at the bank, and it was clear that part of the reason was his political views. And then he chose to release that to the public. So, what are the potential causes of action? The obvious ones being sort of, libel stroke slander, malicious falsehood, and misuse of confidential information. So what about defamation? Well, what would be the defamatory allegation? Let's assume that the stuff in that internal report is defamatory and not just like matters of opinion, because, sort of like, this is these persons' political affiliations, and as a result, we think he is dodgy. That's just an opinion, because, there's this thing that so long as there's a factual basis for forming the opinion and it's a reasonable opinion and you honestly believe that, that as an opinion, then, that is a defence. And it would be very arguable that that is actually, that is actually a matter of opinion. But let's assume it was defamatory, just for the sake of argument. Well, Farage would have to prove a loss. The fact that he released it himself to a wider audience, then any consequences of that he has no claim for because he voluntarily released that. So, you cannot sue on the basis of that. So it would have to be on the basis of, who Coutts released the information to, and that was all inside the organisation. Now, if you release things inside the organisation, that is, it attracts what we call qualified privilege. And qualified privilege applies when either you have a duty to provide the information or somebody has a legitimate interest in receiving the information. And it would be very arguable that, what they call the Wealth Committee, and just the bank generally, that it's legitimate for them to discuss their clients and indeed their political views and their reputation and, the PR of the bank. So that would attract qualified privilege. You can defeat qualified privilege by proving malice. And again, that's malice in the defamatory sense. You know it's not true or you don't care whether it's true or not. And it's for the claimant to prove that malice exists. And the test is that the circumstances are more consistent with there being malice than there not being malice, which is probably not very helpful, really. So, that would seem to cause some difficulties because, like I say, he'd have to get over opinion, he'd have to get over qualified privilege, and also he'd have to show serious harm. Part of the serious harm, of course, might be you can't get a bank account with anybody else. If you can show that, well, other people, that information somehow got to other people. And this is where we come to the breach of confidential material, because it transpires that the head of the group mentioned to the BBC that this was the reason. Oh, because he hasn't met the money. And Dan's gone into all the detail about why that's a breach of GDPR. So let's assume that is established. Well, that then has caused a loss. Now, is that defamatory? Well, it's not libelous because just the mere fact you can't meet Coutts standards, no one's going to think less of you. But it could get into malicious falsehood. Because it's an untrue statement, but the test is calculated to cause loss. So you'd have to show that the person knew that it was untrue or didn't care, was reckless. But because that's what malicious often means in the law, it means sort of like careless or something. You'd have to show that she knew it wasn't true. And calculated to cause loss, like I said on other videos, that's a bit of an objective test. You don't have to sit down and go, I want to do this to cause that person harm. It's just, would the logical and natural conclusion and consequence be that somebody could potentially, suffer a loss? So, that might get over the threshold. But we also come into the misuse of private information. because that's a separate tort, civil wrong in itself. And basically, you don't actually have to show loss there, because just the mere misuse of your information is actionable. If you can show special damages, in other words, I can point to specific losses you can claim. But if it's just a general breach, sometimes they've been as low as like £50 damages for nominal breaches. Seen them as high as £3,000 and usually going for about the £1,500. That's just that you've got some confidential information out there that shouldn't have gone out there. And it all depends on the information. Financial and medical stuff is considered to be, sort of especially sensitive. But yeah, with regards to malicious falsehood, like I say, what you'd have to show is that somehow he's suffered, serious harm or a loss in some way. It's less harm that you have to show actually for malicious falsehood. But you still have to show some loss. Loss of a bank account? Well, he's been offered, this is the thing, under, ironically, EU law, which has been reincorporated into English law, you have to be offered a basic bank account. A bank can't refuse you a basic bank account, except in very special circumstances. But they don't have to offer you all the special fancy accounts or privileges. So, arguably the fact that Coutts said you can just have a bog standard NatWest account, well, really not necessarily suffered any harm there. I mean, yes, I've lost all my fancy banking privileges. It could be. I mean, like I say, I actually turned down a Coutts account because I loved the checkbooks. They were huge, but they didn't have pictures of animals on like my NatWest one. And also, at the time, you had to pay like £1 every time you wrote a check or used the cash machine. And if I want to pay £1 to use the cash machine, I'll use the one in the dodgy off license. But yeah, so there you go. So yeah, actually, I do think Farage has some potential claims here, especially in relation to the misuse of private information. If he were to issue, I doubt if the bank would even fight this. I think you might get a confidential settlement, you might get some payment to charity or something like that. But yeah, I don't think this is a hill that NatWest are going to die on. But anyway, if you enjoyed that, please consider clicking the like button and also possibly subscribing.